The jungle had a sound. Not silence, not noise, but a living, breathing sound that wrapped around everything like wet cloth. Insects humming in layers. Birds calling from canopy to floor. Water dripping from leaves that never fully dried. And underneath it all, the faint rhythm of 12 pairs of jungle boots pressing into red Vietnamese earth, each step measured, each footfall deliberate. Staff Sergeant Patrick Brennan moved through the green darkness of Quang Tri Province with his left hand raised. Slightly fingers spread, ready to close into a fist at any second. It was March 1967, his second tour. 12 Americans behind him in a staggered column, rifles up, eyes scanning the tree line that pressed in from both sides of the narrow trail. They were heading toward a village 3 kilometers ahead where intelligence suggested Viet Cong activity, and the morning fog had not yet burned off the canopy above them. Brennan was 29 years old. Lean, not tall, with the kind of quiet physical confidence that comes from years of hard use rather than gymnasium mirrors. His face was weathered beyond his age, tanned dark from months in country, and his eyes moved constantly, reading the jungle the way a man reads a room full of strangers. He had been doing this long enough to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts were telling him something was wrong. He stopped, closed his fist. The column froze behind him like a single organism holding its breath. The jungle ahead of him had gone quiet. Not completely silent. The insects still hummed. The water still dripped. But the birds had stopped. No calls from the tree line 60 meters ahead. No rustling in the undergrowth. No flash of wings between branches. Just green stillness where there should have been life. His right hand moved to his chest pocket. His fingers found 2 objects resting side by side against his heartbeat. A brass compass, old and warm. A small piece of carved birchwood in the shape of a tiny bird. And in that absolute stillness, standing in a Vietnamese jungle 7,000 miles from home, Patrick Brennan heard 2 voices in his head, as clearly as if the men who owned them were standing on either side of him. One was rough and low-scarred by decades of coal dust, speaking with the cadence of Scranton, Pennsylvania. The other was calm and measured, carrying the soft edges of a Quebec accent. Both voices said the same thing. Listen. What Staff Sergeant Brennan did in the next 60 seconds saved 11 American lives. But this story does not start in the jungles of Vietnam. It starts 7 months earlier at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, with the most embarrassing training exercise in the history of the Green Berets. And it starts with a lesson that the most elite soldiers in America almost did not learn because they were too proud to believe they needed it. But before Fort Bragg, before the Green Berets, before Vietnam, this story starts in a place where men went underground every morning, and not all of them came back up. Scranton, Pennsylvania. Winter 1950. 5 o'clock in the morning, and the mine whistle had not yet blown. Patrick Brennan was 13 years old, standing outside the gates of Anthracite No. 9 in a coat 2 sizes too big that had belonged to his older cousin before tuberculosis took him the previous spring. The Lackawanna Valley spread below in pre-dawn darkness, punctuated by the orange glow of kitchen windows and the steady gray smoke rising from coal stoves and wooden houses that lined the hillside like crooked teeth. The air tasted of anthracite dust and strong coffee and something metallic that never quite went away, the taste of a town built on top of the thing that was slowly killing it. His father, Michael Brennan, stood beside him. 43 years old, but looking 60, with hands so large and calloused, they seemed to belong to a different species than the boys. His fingernails were permanently black from coal dust that no amount of scrubbing could remove, and his dark Irish hair had gone gray at the temples, not from age, but from that powder-fine underground dust that settled into everything. Michael Brennan had gone into the mines at 16. He had never known another life. Every morning before the whistle, Michael would put his hand on his son's shoulder. Not a hug, not a handshake, just a hand heavy and warm resting there for a moment. And every morning, he said the same thing. Remember, Pat? Underground, you listen before you move. You listen to the timbers creaking. You listen to the water dripping. The mind talks to you. If you are too proud or too impatient to listen, it will kill you. Then the whistle would blow, and Michael Brennan would walk through the gates with 300 other men. And Patrick would watch until the cage took his father below the surface, and there was nothing left to see but the cable spinning on the drum. The Brennan kitchen was small and warm at 5 in the morning. Pat's mother had the table set before anyone was awake. Eggs fried in a cast iron skillet that had belonged to her mother. 2 thick slices of bacon from Kowalski's butcher shop on Main Street, cut heavy because Michael Brennan worked a job that burned 4,000 calories before lunch. Toast with butter. Black coffee, no sugar because sugar cost money, and the Brennans did not waste money on things that were not necessary. The radio on the counter played weather and grain prices in a low murmur. Pat sat across from his father and ate in silence because that was how mornings worked in a mining family. You did not talk, you ate. You listened to the mine whistle. You watched your father leave, and you hoped he would come back. In the spring of 1952, the mine stopped talking and started screaming. Pat was 15 when it happened. A timber support in the number 4 shaft gave way without the usual warning creaks, and 40 tons of rock and earth collapsed onto a crew of 9 men working the face. The rescue took 14 hours. They pulled 7 men out alive. Michael Brennan was the 7th. He had a broken back, 3 crushed vertebrae, and he would never walk again. Pat stood in the hospital corridor and watched them wheel his father past on a gurney. Michael's face was gray with dust and shock, but his eyes found his son's eyes and held them, and even then, even with his spine broken and his working life over, he did not look away first. The disability pension was barely enough. Pat took a job at a garage after school, changing oil and rotating tires, and he came home every evening to find his father sitting in a wheelchair at the kitchen table, the same table where they had eaten bacon and eggs in silence every morning for 15 years. Michael would be drinking Irish coffee and staring out the window toward the mine he would never enter again. The smell of coal dust clung to the wheelchair, to his clothes, to the walls of the house. It never left. Even when the man could no longer go underground, the underground stayed with him. In 1955, Patrick Brennan turned 18 and made a decision. He would not go into the mines. He would go into the Army. The morning he left for basic training, his father called him to the kitchen table. Michael reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out a brass compass. It was old, scratched with a crack running across the crystal face. The needle wobbled slightly, but still found north. A mining compass, the kind surveyors and foremen used underground to orient tunnels. This got me through 20 years underground. It will get you back home. Remember, always listen before you move. Pat took the compass. It was heavier than he expected, warm from his father's body heat, and it fit perfectly in his palm, as if the brass had been shaped by years of being held by the same hand. He put it in his chest pocket directly over his heart. He would carry it there for the next 12 years without missing a single day. Fort Benning, Georgia. Airborne School. Then the Special Forces Qualification Course, the Q course, where the Army separated the men who wanted to be Green Berets from the men who actually could be. Brennan was not the fastest or the strongest in his class, but he was patient. He could sit still longer than anyone. He could wait. He could watch. The instructors noticed this. They said he had the temperament for it. What they did not know was that he had learned patience from a man who spent 20 years listening to Timber Creek in the darkness, waiting for the mountain to tell him whether it was safe to move. By 1963, Brennan was assigned to the 5th Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. By 1965, he was in Vietnam on his first tour running ambush operations against the Viet Cong in the Central Highlands. He was good at it. Better than good. His team set ambushes that worked every single time. Claymore mines detonated at the perfect moment. Fields of fire interlocked like the teeth of a zipper. The enemy walked into his kill zones and never walked out. In 18 months, Brennan's team was never once detected before they opened fire. Not once. He came back to Fort Bragg in mid-1966 with a reputation, one of the best team sergeants in the 5th, a quiet professional who knew his craft. He was preparing for his second tour scheduled for late 1966 and he carried himself with the steady confidence of a man who had proven himself in combat and knew exactly how good he was. Brennan had never failed an ambush exercise in his career. He was about to fail 6 times in one day, and a soldier from Quebec he had never heard of was going to teach him why. Fort Bragg in the summer of 1966 was a furnace wrapped in pine trees. The heat rose from the sandy soil of the North Carolina sandhills in visible waves, and the longleaf pines that covered the training areas stood motionless in air so humid it felt like breathing through a washcloth. Cicadas screamed from every direction. The barracks smelled of gun oil, boot leather, and sweat that never fully dried. The 5th Special Forces Group was split between 2 worlds that summer. The bulk of the unit was deployed to Nha Trang, Vietnam, under the command of Colonel Francis Kelly, running combat operations across all 4 military regions of South Vietnam. Back at Fort Bragg, the rear detachment handled training and preparation for teams rotating in and out of the war zone. Colonel Raymond Caldwell commanded the rear detachment. He was 48, a career officer from Virginia, with silver at his temples and the crisp diction of a man who had spent his life giving orders to people who followed them. Caldwell believed in the American system of warfare with the conviction of a preacher. Firepower, technology, aggression, support. When things went wrong, you called for helicopter gunships. When they went very wrong, you called for artillery. When they went catastrophically wrong, you called for airstrikes. The system worked. It worked because America had more of everything than anyone else on Earth, and Caldwell saw no reason to question a system that had been winning wars for 20 years. In late July, Caldwell received orders to organize a joint training exercise with Allied forces. The Canadian military had agreed to send a platoon of paratroopers from their Defense of Canada force to serve as opposing force for Green Beret teams preparing for Vietnam deployment. The Canadians would patrol through Fort Bragg's training areas while 6 American teams attempted to ambush them. It was straightforward, standard, almost routine. Caldwell briefed the exercise to his teams on a Tuesday afternoon in a classroom that smelled of chalk and floor wax. 72 Green Berets sat in folding chairs and listened. "Gentlemen, we have Canadian paratroopers arriving next week to serve as opposing force for ambush training. Defense of Canada force from the Royal 22nd Regiment. Good soldiers, but primarily peacekeepers. I expect our positions to perform as designed. This is a tune-up before deployment, not a competition." Brennan sat in the 3rd row next to Captain James Kowalski, a Polish-American from Chicago who had already completed 2 tours in Vietnam and had the blunt confidence of a man who had killed people and been shot at enough times to stop flinching. Kowalski leaned over and whispered, "Peacekeepers. What are they going to do, observe our positions and write a report?" Brennan smiled but said nothing. He respected all soldiers. He had worked with Australians and South Koreans and Montagnard tribesmen, and he knew better than to dismiss anyone based on a label. But he also knew what he knew. He had ambushed Viet Cong fighters who were among the most experienced guerrilla warriors in the world, and he had beaten them every single time. Canadian peacekeepers from Quebec. He would treat them with courtesy. He did not expect them to teach him anything. If you want to see what happened when the best Special Forces soldiers in America met a different kind of warrior, and how a single training exercise at Fort Bragg changed the way these men fought in Vietnam and saved lives that would have been lost, stay with me. And if you are a veteran who learned hard lessons from unexpected places, hit subscribe. This story is for you. The Canadians arrived on a Monday morning in a green military bus that pulled up to the Fort Bragg barracks, trailing a cloud of Carolina dust. 30 paratroopers stepped off carrying rucksacks and FNC 1A1 rifles, the Canadian version of the Belgian FALA weapon that was reliable and accurate, but carried no particular mystique. Their combat uniforms were standard cotton. Their boots were standard issue. The only thing that set them apart visually was the maroon beret of the airborne soldier, worn at a slight angle in the way that paratroopers everywhere wear their berets with an understated pride that does not need explanation. Captain Marcel Tremblay stepped off the bus last. He was 34 years old, medium height, medium build, with a narrow face. dark brown eyes, and black hair cut regulation short. He spoke English with a light Quebec accent that softened his consonants and elongated his vowels in a way that made everything he said sound slightly more deliberate than it was. Tremblay had been in the Canadian Army since 1952, the same year Michael Brennan's spine broke in Anthracite No. 9. He had served with the Royal 22nd Regiment, the legendary Vendus, and had deployed to Cyprus in 1964 with the United Nations Peacekeeping Force, where he had spent 11 months patrolling the buffer zone between Greek and Turkish Cypriots who wanted nothing more than to kill each other. In Cyprus, Tremblay had watched 2 Canadian soldiers die in an ambush that no one saw coming. 30 more were wounded. It was the kind of experience that either breaks a man or remakes him, and Tremblay had been remade. He had learned one lesson above all others. The ones who survived were the ones who were patient enough to see the trap before they walked into it. That evening, the Americans hosted a welcome dinner in the Fort Bragg mess hall. The tables were loaded in a way that made the Canadians stop and stare. Grilled steaks thick enough to hold in one hand, buttered corn on the cob piled in aluminum trays, potato salad, coleslaw rolls with real butter, and apple pie with vanilla ice cream for dessert. Coca-Cola in cans, sweating with condensation. Coffee by the gallon. This was the American military at the table, and the table was abundant. Sergeant Duncan Fraser, a 32-year-old Scottish-Canadian from Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, leaned toward Corporal Réjean Pelletier and muttered something that several Americans overheard. "This is more food than our field rations for a week." The atmosphere was friendly. 2 groups of professional soldiers sizing each other up over steak and pie, asking polite questions, telling careful stories. Brennan sat across from Tremblay at a long table near the windows. They talked easily enough. Tremblay asked about Vietnam. Brennan gave the short version. The mountains, the heat, the enemy who could disappear into the jungle like smoke. Tremblay listened, nodded, asked follow-up questions that showed he understood more about small unit operations than a peacekeeper was supposed to. At the end of the meal, Brennan asked the question that courtesy required. "So, Captain, what kind of operations have you run?" Tremblay set down his coffee. "Peacekeeping. Cyprus. Patrols between Greek and Turkish lines." Brennan nodded, respectful but unmoved. In his mind, the distance between peacekeeping patrols and Viet Cong ambushes was measured in light years. He thanked Tremblay for the conversation and stood to leave. What Brennan did not see because he was already walking away was the change in Tremblay's eyes. Those calm, dark brown eyes had been watching everything all evening. The way the Americans sat, the way they talked about their equipment, the level of confidence in their voices when they mentioned ambush tactics. Tremblay had read the mess hall the way he read terrain. Patient, thorough, missing nothing. The man Brennan had just dismissed as a peacekeeper had survived an ambush in Cyprus that killed 2 of his soldiers and wounded 30. He simply had not mentioned it over dinner. Among the Canadians were 2 men whose skills would reshape what the Green Berets thought they knew about fieldcraft. Corporal Réjean Pelletier was 26, an Acadian from Bathurst, New Brunswick, who had grown up hunting deer and bear in the Miramichi forests with a grandfather who trapped for a living. The old man had taught him to read the woods the way a scholar reads a book, one detail at a time, never rushing, never assuming. If the crows go quiet, something is there. If the moss is disturbed, something passed through. Pelletier could move through dense forest without snapping a twig or leaving a visible footprint. His platoon mates called him Le Fantôme, the ghost. Sergeant Duncan Fraser was older, quieter, and possessed a skill that most modern soldiers had never been trained to develop. Fraser had grown up on the coast of Cape Breton, the son of a fisherman who went to sea before dawn and came home after dark. The boy had spent his childhood in 2 worlds, the Atlantic Ocean and the boreal forest that pressed down to the shoreline, and in both worlds, he had learned to read the behavior of animals the way other people read newspapers. He knew when gulls were disturbed by something beneath the water. He knew when a fox had passed through a clearing by the way songbirds adjusted their calls. And he knew, with a certainty that came from a lifetime of observation, that when birds go silent in a section of forest, something is there that should not be. Fraser served with Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, but had been attached to this Joint Defense of Canada Force Patrol as one of the few Anglophone soldiers with the wilderness tracking skills that the mission profile demanded. Fraser taught his tracking methods to every man in the platoon. It was not complicated. It was not secret. It was simply older than armies, older than nations, a hunter's knowledge passed down through generations of men who survived because they paid attention. The Defense of Canada Force trained its paratroopers for a world without support. Their operational mandate was the Canadian Arctic and wilderness. Weeks in the taiga with no resupply. No helicopter extraction. No artillery on call. No airstrikes. If something went wrong, you solved it yourself, or you did not solve it at all. Survival depended on one thing above everything else: not being detected. This created a fundamentally different tactical mindset from the Green Berets, who trained within a system that assumed support was always available. Both approaches were professional. Both produced excellent soldiers. But they were aimed at different problems, and they created different instincts. The night of August 22nd, 1966, 6 Green Beret teams infiltrated their ambush positions in the pine forests of Fort Bragg. Each team consisted of 12 men, the standard operational detachment Alpha, and each had selected and prepared its position with the care and precision that comes from collective decades of experience. Brennan and his team occupied Position 4 along the projected Canadian patrol route. He had chosen a site in a stand of longleaf pines where the terrain offered clear fields of fire, natural concealment, and covered withdrawal routes. His men dug fighting positions and camouflaged them with pine boughs and fallen needles. 4M. 18. A1 Claymore mines were positioned to cover the kill zone. The word stamped on the front of every Claymore said everything that needed to be said about their purpose. Front to enemy. Each mine contained 700 steel ball bearings packed behind a 1.5 pounds of C4 explosive. When detonated, those ball bearings swept the kill zone in a 60-degree arc at a velocity that left nothing standing within 50 meters. In Vietnam, the Claymore was the most effective ambush weapon in the American arsenal, but it only worked if the enemy walked into the kill zone. 2 M60 machine guns were sighted to create interlocking fire across the area where the Canadian patrol would pass. Everything was textbook. Everything was professional. Brennan checked every position, every wire, every angle of fire, and when he was satisfied, he settled into his own fighting hole and waited. Further along the route, Captain Kowalski and his team held Position 5 at a natural choke point where the trail passed through a narrow gap in dense vegetation. Kowalski had set a classic L-shaped ambush that would catch the Canadians in converging fire with no easy escape route. He was confident, bordering on certain. This is a kill box. Nothing gets through without triggering it. At Position 6, the last and most elaborate of all, Major Donald Hargrove had spent hours creating what he considered an undetectable masterpiece. Multiple layers of claymores. Carefully concealed fighting positions with overhead cover. Communication wire linking all elements. Withdrawal routes pre-planned and rehearsed. Hargrove was 42, the most experienced Special Forces officer at Fort Bragg, a man who had been setting ambushes since before some of his soldiers were born. If the Canadians find this position, he announced to his team with the easy confidence of a man making a bet, he knew he would win. I will buy their whole damn platoon a case of beer. Night settled over Fort Bragg. Brennan lay in his fighting hole and watched the stars through gaps in the pine canopy. The forest was alive around him. Frogs calling from a stream 20 meters to his east. Crickets in the underbrush. An owl somewhere in the darkness. He reached into his chest pocket and felt the compass warm against his fingertips. Always listen before you move. He had carried his father's words with him for 11 years through airborne school and the Q course and the jungles of Vietnam, and he believed he understood them. Listen meant pay attention. Listen meant follow orders. Listen meant be aware. But lying in a fighting hole in the North Carolina pines waiting to spring an ambush on soldiers, he did not consider a serious threat. Patrick Brennan did not yet understand what his father had really meant. Michael Brennan had not said, listen to orders. He had said, listen to the mine. Listen to the timbers. Listen to the water. Listen to the earth itself. Somewhere in the forest, barely a kilometer away, 30 Canadian paratroopers were sleeping lightly under ponchos, preparing for a morning that would change the way every American in these woods thought about war. And in 8 hours, a corporal from New Brunswick, who could move through the forest like a ghost, would teach Staff Sergeant Patrick Brennan the difference between listening to orders and listening to the world around him. Dawn came to Fort Bragg on August 23, 1966. The way it always came in late summer, slowly, reluctantly, the darkness giving way to gray and then to gold as the sun climbed above the pine flats and the heat began to build. By 0800, when the Canadian patrol stepped off from their assembly area and began moving along the designated route, the temperature was already above 80 degrees and the air was thick enough to chew. In the Exercise Control Center, Colonel Caldwell and his staff watched the operation unfold on a map table. Blue markers represented the Canadian patrol. Red markers showed the 6 American ambush positions. The Canadians were moving south along a route that would take them through or past each position in sequence. All Caldwell had to do was wait for the blue markers to enter the red zones. Then the radios would crackle with contact reports, exercise controllers would score the ambushes, and everyone would go back to the barracks with lessons learned and egos intact. 15 minutes into the patrol, something unusual appeared on the map. The blue markers had barely moved. The Canadians had covered less than 200 meters apace, so slow it seemed almost stationary. A staff officer frowned at the map. Why are they crawling? At this rate, they will need until next week to finish the route. An older American sergeant major, who had worked with Canadian forces on a NATO exercise years earlier, stood at the back of the room with his arms crossed. He shook his head slightly. They are reading the terrain. Every time they stop, they are looking at what is ahead, what is to the sides where an ambush might be set. They are not trying to cover distance. They are trying to survive. Nobody in the room took that observation seriously. Speed mattered. Completing the mission mattered. Covering ground was how you got things done. The idea that moving slowly was itself a tactical advantage was so foreign to American doctrine that it did not register as anything other than inefficiency. In the forest, the reality was very different from what the maps showed. Corporal Réjean Pelletier moved at the point of the Canadian formation like something that had grown from the forest floor. 20 meters forward. Stop. Kneel. Binoculars up. 2 minutes of observation, scanning left, right ahead, checking the tree line at middle distance, then the ground in front, then the canopy above. Listening, smelling. Reading every detail the way his grandfather had taught him to read the Miramichi woods. Captain Tremblay watched Pelletier from the middle of the formation through his own binoculars. He had worked with Pelletier for 2 years and knew every signal the corporal gave. The angle of his head, the speed of his movements, the way his shoulders tensed when something caught his attention. And right now, Pelletier's head was tilted slightly to the left, which meant he was seeing something that did not belong. Pelletier raised his fist. The entire patrol froze. 30 men became statues. Pelletier turned his head slowly until his eyes met Tremblay's across the formation, and he spoke 2 words in French, barely above a whisper. Ils sont là. They are there. Tremblay moved forward in a low crouch and settled beside Pelletier behind a fallen pine. 50 meters ahead, the forest looked ordinary. Longleaf pines, sandy soil, scattered underbrush. Nothing that would make an untrained eye pause. Pelletier pointed. His whisper was precise and clinical. Sir, the branches on those pines are broken at wrong angles. Wind here comes from the southwest. I can feel it on my neck right now. But those breaks face east. Someone bent them to clear a field of fire. Also, there is a slight depression in the ground about 30 meters ahead. Could be natural, but the shape is too regular. Fighting position. And look at the base of the third tree from the left. The pine needles on the ground have been swept and rearranged. Natural fall pattern is random. That pattern is too even. Someone cleaned up after themselves, but they cleaned too well. Tremblay studied the area through his binoculars for a full minute. Then he made a decision that would have been unthinkable to the Americans waiting in that tree line. He did not advance. He did not attempt to engage. He did not even try to confirm the position. He simply went around it. The patrol swung west, maintaining a distance of more than 70 meters from the suspected position, well outside the lethal arc of Claymore mines. When they had passed the danger area entirely, Tremblay sent 2 soldiers back to observe the American position from behind, from an angle that the ambush setup did not cover. The 2 Canadians low crawled to within 30 meters of the Green Beret fighting holes. They spent 10 minutes identifying every position, every weapon, every claymore. Then they withdrew without being detected. The Americans in Position 1 had no idea they had been found. They had no idea they had been observed from behind. And they had no idea that the patrol they were waiting to ambush had already passed them and was moving toward Position 2. The radio call to Colonel Caldwell came with the confused tone of a team leader who could not explain what he was seeing. "Sir, the Canadians just bypassed our position. They went around us. They did not enter the kill zone." Caldwell's response carried the certainty of a man who was not yet ready to question his assumptions. They probably took a different route for terrain reasons. Maintain your position. At Position 2, the Canadians found what the Americans had left behind in the soft sand of the sandhills. Boot prints. American jungle boots have a distinctive tread pattern, different from the Canadian combat boots, and the soldiers who had moved from the tree line to their fighting positions in the darkness had not fully erased their tracks. The sand was too fine, too soft, and it held impressions like memory holds pain. Pelletier spotted the prints from 15 meters and marked the position without breaking stride. At Position 3, it was Sergeant Fraser who stopped the patrol. He held up his hand and inhaled slowly through his nose, nostrils flaring slightly. Then he turned to Tremblay with an expression that was almost apologetic, as if he were sorry for what he was about to say. "Captain, I can smell DEET, military insect repellent. The wind is coming from the southwest, and the scent is coming from that tree line. Someone sprayed it within the last 12 hours. 3 positions, 3 different detection methods. 3 failures for the American side that nobody in those fighting holes yet understood." In the exercise control center, the mood had shifted. Caldwell stared at the map where 3 red positions had been marked as bypassed. 3 of 6. He picked up the radio handset and called Position 3 directly. The team leader's voice came back tight with frustration. "Sir, with respect, they are not taking random routes. They stopped about 75 meters from our position, spent several minutes observing, and then deliberately went around us. They know we are here." Caldwell set the handset down slowly. For the first time in the exercise, he did not have an immediate answer. He sat for a long moment looking at the map, looking at the red markers that represented years of tactical doctrine and combat experience. And then he made a decision that would prove to be the most important one of the day. All teams maintain positions. Let us see if they can find all 6. Brennan heard the radio traffic from his fighting hole at Position 4. 3 teams before him had been bypassed. 3 carefully prepared ambush positions detected and avoided by soldiers his colonel had described as peacekeepers. For the first time since he had arrived in the Army, the bedrock confidence that had carried him through Vietnam began to shift beneath him. Not crack, not break, just shift the way the earth shifts before a mine collapse, a subtle movement that only someone paying attention would notice. He checked his position one more time. Everything was perfect. The camouflage was flawless. The fields of fire were clean. The claymores were oriented precisely. There was no way anyone could see him. He reached for the compass, held it tight. Always listen before you move. But he was not moving. He was waiting. He did not need to listen. He needed the enemy to walk into his trap, and that he would understand later was the fundamental error. He was thinking about what the enemy needed to do. He was not thinking about what the forest was already telling them about where he was. The Canadian patrol was 60 meters from Brennan's position when Sergeant Duncan Fraser raised his hand and the column stopped. Fraser did not move for almost a full minute. He stood perfectly still with his head tilted slightly, the way a man tilts his head when he is trying to hear something faint beneath a louder sound. His eyes were not focused on the tree line ahead. They were unfocused, soft, taking in the whole picture rather than any single detail. And what he was taking in was not something he could see. 2 minutes earlier, the forest around the patrol had been alive with birdsong. Carolina wrens calling their sharp tea kettle notes from the understory. A downy woodpecker tapping somewhere to the east. Pine warblers trilling from the canopy. The layered overlapping chorus that a healthy pine forest produces on a summer morning when nothing is wrong. Now the section of tree line directly ahead of the patrol had gone quiet. Not silent. The insects still hummed. But the birds had stopped calling from a specific area roughly 40 meters wide, as if someone had drawn an invisible line, and everything with wings had decided not to cross it. Fraser waved Tremblay forward. The captain moved up in a low crouch and settled beside him. Fraser spoke without taking his eyes off the quiet tree line. Captain, the birds have gone quiet in that section, about 40 meters wide, centered on those taller pines. Everything around it is still singing. Just that patch is dead. Tremblay raised his binoculars and scanned the area slowly. Fraser continued. Also, there is a small stream running through that area. See where it bends near the base of that pine cluster? The far bank is disturbed. The mud has been pressed down and partially smoothed over, but not by an animal. The impression pattern is too wide and too flat. Boot heel. Someone crossed there and tried to cover the print, but mud remembers differently than sand. And Captain, look at the canopy on the 2 tallest pines in that group. The lower branches have been removed, not broken by wind or ice. Cut. The wood inside the bark is white and fresh. 12 hours, maybe less. Pelletier, who had crawled up on the other side, added his observation in a whisper. Confirmed. The pine needle pattern on the ground at the base of those trees has been rearranged, cleared and replaced. Same as position 1. Tremblay lowered his binoculars. He did not need to discuss it. 3 indicators converging on the same location. Bird behavior, ground disturbance, vegetation alteration. Each one alone might be coincidence. Together, they were a signature as clear to men trained to read it as a neon sign would have been to anyone else. There is a reason these Canadians spotted what the Americans could not. And it has nothing to do with intelligence or equipment or physical ability. Birds have an instinctive reaction to human presence. They stop calling. They move away. They avoid areas where people are hiding in ways that are invisible to anyone who has not learned to watch for it. Indigenous hunters across North America had known this for thousands of years. Canadian wilderness trackers and trappers had passed this knowledge down through generations. But American Special Forces training in 1966 did not include reading animal behavior as a detection method. The Green Berets trained with technology and firepower and speed. The Canadians trained with patience and silence and the oldest surveillance system on Earth, the birds. Bypass. Standard distance. Send reconnaissance after we pass. The patrol swung east, keeping well outside the effective range of any weapons that might be positioned in the tree line. They moved slowly, deliberately, adding 20 minutes to their route to avoid an area they could have walked through in 5. And that was the point. That was the entire philosophy compressed into a single tactical decision. 20 minutes of caution weighed against the possibility of walking into a kill zone. Inside position 4. Staff Sergeant Patrick Brennan watched it happen. He lay in his fighting hole with his eye against the rear sight of his M60, tracking the Canadian formation as it appeared at the edge of his observation range, and then stopped. He saw them pause. He saw the stillness that meant they were studying something. And then he saw them turn away. Not in confusion, not in haste, with the calm deliberation of men who knew exactly what they were doing and why. They had seen him. Somehow from 60 meters away through camouflage that had fooled Viet Cong guerrillas, who grew up in the jungle, the Canadians had looked at his position and known he was there. Brennan gripped the compass hard enough to feel the cracked crystal press into his palm. And in that moment, a thought he had never once allowed himself to think surfaced, like something long buried. What if my ambushes in Vietnam worked not because I was good, but because I was lucky? He pushed the thought down. There was no room for it. Not here, not in a fighting hole, not with a mission to complete. But the thought did not go away. It settled into the bottom of his mind like sediment in still water waiting. The Canadian reconnaissance team came and went from behind his position without Brennan or any of his 12 men detecting their presence. They observed for 10 minutes. They documented everything, and they left the way they had come, invisible, soundless like the ghost that Pelletier's platoon mate said he was. If you are watching this and thinking about a time someone showed you something you could not see on your own, a blind spot you did not know you had, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Position 5 was Captain Kowalski's masterpiece. The natural choke point where the trail narrowed between walls of dense vegetation was the kind of terrain that ambush planners dream about. There was no easy way around it. The undergrowth on both sides was thick enough to slow any movement to a crawl, and the trail itself passed directly through an L-shaped kill zone where interlocking machine gun fire would catch anyone in the open with no cover and no escape. Kowalski had set this ambush with the confidence of 2 Vietnam tours and the knowledge that this was exactly the kind of position that had killed Viet Cong by the dozen. The Canadian patrol halted well short of the choke point. Pelletier had stopped the column out of instinct before anyone gave an order. Tremblay moved forward, studied the terrain for 3 minutes through his binoculars, and then turned to his point man with an expression that was almost amused. That is an obvious ambush location. If I were setting an ambush, that is exactly where I would put it. He did not look for the specific positions. He did not try to identify weapon placements or claymore locations. He simply looked at the ground and asked himself one question. Where would I want my enemy to walk if I wanted to kill him? The answer was the choke point, which meant the choke point was the one place he would not go. Find us an alternate route. Keep us outside machine gun range. The alternate route took the patrol through terrain that was harder to cross. Thick brush, small ravines, loose sand that grabbed at boots and sapped energy. It added a full hour to their movement time. Kowalski's team waited in their perfect position, watching their perfect kill zone, and no one came. Afterward, a 4-man Canadian team backtracked to confirm and document the American position. They found everything. The L-shaped layout, the machine guns, the claymores, the communication wire. They noted it all with the quiet efficiency of men conducting a routine task, and they moved on. The logic was inverted, and it was devastating in its simplicity. American doctrine selected ambush positions based on where the terrain was best for killing. Canadian doctrine avoided those exact locations because terrain that was ideal for an ambush was terrain that a patient enemy would recognize as ideal for an ambush. What made a position strong from one perspective made it obvious from another. The Americans were thinking like hunters. The Canadians were thinking like prey who had learned to hunt back. Position 6 was Major Donald Hargrove's monument to tactical preparation. He had spent more time on this position than any other team leader had spent on theirs. Multiple layers of claymore mines creating overlapping kill zones, fighting positions with overhead cover that blended into the forest floor, communication wire linking every element so the entire ambush could be triggered in coordinated sequence, withdrawal routes rehearsed and marked. Hargrove was the most experienced Special Forces officer at Fort Bragg, and this position represented everything he knew about the art of the ambush. The Canadians found it in 5 minutes. The combination of indicators was almost redundant by this point. Vegetation cut with tools instead of broken by natural force. Earth disturbed in patterns too regular to be animal activity. And the decisive piece of evidence, a section of black communication wire, no more than a few centimeters visible, where it crossed a small gap in the vegetation over a patch of white sand. It was barely noticeable. In a jungle environment with vines and roots covering every surface, it might have been invisible. But on the clean sand floor of a Carolina pine forest, those few centimeters of black wire stood out to eyes that were looking for exactly that kind of detail. Pelletier marked it. The patrol bypassed it. The reconnaissance team documented it. The radio call from Hargrove to the Exercise Control Center carried the sound of a man confronting something he had believed to be impossible. A long silence before speaking, the kind of silence that fills the space where certainty used to be. "Sir, they found us. 5 minutes." Colonel Caldwell stood at the map table and looked at 6 red markers, every one of them circled in blue. 6 of 6. 0 successful ambushes. 0 contact. 0 results from 72 of the most highly trained special operations soldiers in the United States Army against 30 Canadian paratroopers. He took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, put the glasses back on, Then he picked up the radio handset and spoke in a voice that was quieter than anyone in the room had heard from him before. "Recall all teams. End the patrol phase. We need to debrief." The after-action review took place that evening in a classroom at Fort Bragg. The room was full. 6 Green Beret teams on one side, the Canadian patrol on the other. Exercise controllers along the back wall. Colonel Caldwell at the front. The overhead lights hummed. The air conditioning labored against the August heat. And the atmosphere carried the particular tension of professional soldiers who have just been forced to question something fundamental about their own capabilities. But before Caldwell opened the debrief, there was the matter of the notes. The exercise controllers had collected them from each of the 6 positions. 6 sheets of paper handwritten in English left at each site after the Canadian reconnaissance teams had completed their observations. When Caldwell first heard about the notes, his jaw had tightened. When he read them, his jaw loosened. And when he distributed them to the American teams, the room went silent in a way that had nothing to do with military discipline and everything to do with surprise. Brennan held the note from position 4. His eyes moved over the words with the slow care of a man reading something important for the first time. Position 4. Observations. Your position was revealed by the following indicators. 1. Birds avoided your section of the tree line, indicating human presence in an area where birds would normally be active. 2. A stream bank near your position showed evidence of human disturbance inconsistent with animal tracks, specifically a boot impression on the far bank that had been partially concealed. 3. Lower pine branches had been recently removed with a cutting tool rather than broken by wind or natural causes. Fresh cuts showed white wood inside the bark, visible from a distance. Recommendations. Monitor bird behavior around your own position. Birds that go quiet or leave an area are signaling your presence to any observer trained to watch for this indicator. When crossing streams, approach from downstream, so water flow carries any disturbance away from likely observation points. When modifying vegetation for camouflage, break branches rather than cutting them and match the break pattern to natural wind damage in the surrounding area. Well-selected terrain otherwise. Respect. Defensive Canada Force paratroopers. Brennan read it twice, then a third time. He had expected mockery. He had expected the kind of gloating that soldiers sometimes indulge in when they have beaten a rival. What he held in his hands was neither of those things. It was instruction. Specific, professional, constructive instruction from soldiers who had taken the time to explain exactly what was wrong and exactly how to fix it. And they had ended with the word that carried more weight than any boast could have. Respect. He looked across the room at Tremblay, who sat in a folding chair with his hands resting on his knees, and his expression as calm and unreadable as it had been at the dinner table 2 days before. And Brennan felt something shift inside him again, deeper this time. Something closer to the sensation he had felt as a boy, watching his father go underground every morning, knowing the man was entering a world that could kill him, and respecting him not for his strength, but for his willingness to listen to the darkness. Caldwell let the room finish reading. Then he spoke. Gentlemen, the Canadians successfully identified and avoided all 6 ambush positions without triggering any of them. This is not the result we expected, and we need to understand how it happened and what we can learn from it. He turned to Tremblay. Captain, walk us through how your patrol spotted our positions. Tremblay stood and moved to the map board at the front of the room. His briefing was precise and unhurried. He went through each position in sequence. Broken branches at wrong angles, boot prints in sand, the smell of insect repellent on the wind, birds avoiding human presence, terrain too favorable for ambush to be trusted, communication wire exposed on white sand. For each position, he identified the specific indicators, explained how his soldiers had detected them, and described the decision to bypass. The room grew quieter with each position. These were not exotic techniques requiring special equipment. These were observations that any well-trained soldier should have been able to make. And that was the part that hurt. The Green Berets had not been defeated by superior technology or superior numbers. They had been defeated by the ability to see things that were right in front of them. Things that they had been trained to create, but never trained to detect. When Tremblay finished, the silence in the room had the weight of something physical. Captain James Kowalski stood up. His voice was controlled, but carried an edge that came from 2 combat tours and a professional pride that was not ready to bend. Captain Tremblay, your briefing suggests that our positions were poorly camouflaged and that we made basic fieldcraft errors. I disagree with that assessment. My team used standard Special Forces camouflage techniques that have proven effective in combat operations in Vietnam. I have used these techniques successfully on 2 tours. The room held its breath. Tremblay looked at Kowalski for a moment before responding. When he spoke, his voice carried no defensiveness, no superiority, no heat. Just the steady calm of a man stating something he knew to be true. Captain Kowalski, I do not suggest your techniques are poor or your soldiers unprofessional. But techniques that are effective against one enemy in one environment may not work against forces trained to operate differently with different detection methods. He paused. Then he said the thing that changed the room. My soldiers trained to operate in Canadian wilderness, where there is no support available, no helicopter gunships, no artillery, no airstrikes. If we are compromised, there is no extraction. Survival depends entirely on not being detected in the first place. We train as if no one is coming to save us. That creates a different tactical approach. Patience. Observation. The forest speaks to those who are patient enough to listen. In your Vietnam, the jungle speaks the same language. The question is whether your soldiers are listening. Brennan sat in the back row with his hand in his pocket fingers around the compass. His father had said the mind talks to you. This man from Quebec was saying the same thing in different words. 2 different worlds. Same truth. And Brennan, who had spent 10 years in the Army and survived a combat tour in Vietnam, was only now hearing it for the first time. Because hearing requires something harder than skill or courage. It requires the willingness to admit you were not hearing it before. And then a second thought colder than the first. Viet Cong guerrillas did not have helicopter gunships either. They did not have artillery on call. They survived in the jungle the same way the Canadians survived in the taiga, by not being detected by reading terrain by patience. If the VC had the same fieldcraft skills as these Canadians, then every successful ambush Brennan had conducted in Vietnam might have worked not because his positions were undetectable, but because the specific enemy he faced at that specific time had not been looking hard enough. Or had been unlucky. Luck was not a skill, and luck runs out. Major Hargrove broke the silence from the back of the room. His voice was quieter than anyone expected from a man of his rank and experience. "Captain Tremblay, you mentioned your team left notes at each of our positions. Can we see those notes?" It was the first gesture from a senior American officer that pointed toward learning rather than defending, and Caldwell seized it. This exercise did not go as planned, but it has given us lessons worth more than a dozen successful exercises. He looked directly at Tremblay. "Captain, would your soldiers be willing to conduct training sessions with our teams? We clearly have gaps that need to be addressed before anyone deploys to Vietnam." This was the moment. Not the moment of defeat which had happened in the forest. This was the moment of decision which happened in a classroom. A colonel in the United States Army, a man responsible for training the most elite soldiers his nation possessed, was asking a captain from a smaller allied military to teach his men. And he was doing it in front of everyone without hedging, without qualification, without protecting his ego or anyone else's. If there was a definition of American values at their best, this was it. Not the refusal to fail, the refusal to let failure be wasted. Tremblay nodded. "It would be our honor, Colonel." From the back of the room, Hargrove spoke again. "And Captain, I owe your platoon a case of beer." The room laughed. Not loudly, not long, but enough to break something that needed breaking. After the debrief, as men filed out into the warm North Carolina evening, Brennan followed Tremblay through the door. Crickets sang from the grass alongside the building. The sky was turning purple above the pine trees, and the air smelled of pine resin and cooling asphalt. Captain Tremblay. Tremblay turned. Brennan stood there for a moment, and the two impulses that had been fighting inside him all day reached their final confrontation. The Green Beret, who had never failed an ambush, wanted to walk away to dismiss the whole exercise as a fluke, to tell himself that what worked against Viet Cong in real combat mattered more than what happened in a training exercise in North Carolina. And the coal miner's son from Scranton, who had been taught to listen before he moved, knew that walking away would be the most dangerous step he had ever taken. Because the next time he set an ambush in Vietnam, the enemy might be listening the way these Canadians listened. And if he had not learned what the Canadians knew, the next ambush might be his last. "Your man Fraser, the one who heard the birds. Can he teach me?" Tremblay studied Brennan's face. Whatever he found there satisfied him. "Fraser can teach you to listen, but you have to be willing to be slow. And in your army, slow is not popular." "I do not care about popular. I care about bringing my men back alive." Tremblay smiled for the first time since he had arrived at Fort Bragg. A small smile barely visible in the fading light, but real. "Then we start tomorrow." The week that followed was the most important week of Patrick Brennan's military career, and it had nothing to do with combat. Every morning, Fraser met Brennan at the edge of the pine forest before sunrise, when the air was still cool enough to carry scent, and the birds were just beginning their first calls of the day. The first lesson was vegetation reading, and it began with a question that sounded simple and was not. "What do you see?" Brennan looked at the section of forest Fraser was pointing to. "Trees. Underbrush. Sandy ground covered in pine needles. Trees. Look again." Fraser knelt beside a bush and pointed to branches on the left side that were bent toward the east. "Someone passed through here heading east, probably within the last 24 hours. The bend has not sprung back yet, which means the branch was stressed past its natural flex point, but not broken. Now look at the ground. Pine needles are compressed in a pattern that matches a boot heel. Shallow, but visible if you know the shape you are looking for." Brennan knelt beside him. He stared at the ground. For 10 years, he had walked through forests on 4 continents, and he had never once looked at a bent branch and thought about what direction a person had been traveling. He had been trained to move through terrain. He had never been trained to read it. Fraser led him deeper into the woods. Every few meters, he would stop and point out another sign. A scrape on the bark of a pine where a rucksack had brushed it. A heel impression in soft sand that had been partially covered by wind, but still showed the distinctive curve of a military boot. A spiderweb broken at chest height suggesting a man rather than an animal had passed through. Brennan began to see the forest differently. What had been a backdrop, a stage set for operations, was becoming a text written in a language he was only now learning to read. The second morning was birds. Fraser sat Brennan down at the edge of a clearing as dawn broke and the forest woke up. Close your eyes. Listen. Do not try to identify anything. Just let the sound come to you. 10 minutes of silence. Brennan heard bird song building in layers around him. Wrens close by sharp and immediate. Woodpeckers further away percussive. Warblers in the canopy thin and high. The whole forest was talking, and for the first time in his life, Brennan was hearing it as language rather than noise. Now I am going to send Pelletier into that tree line on the far side of the clearing. Keep your eyes closed. Tell me when he enters the trees. 3 minutes passed. The bird song continued. Then the wrens on the north side of the clearing stopped calling. Not all at once, but in a wave spreading outward from a point like ripples in water. 30 seconds later, the warblers above that same area went quiet. Brennan raised his hand. He is north, in the pines, about 20 meters in. He opened his eyes. Pelletier was standing in the tree line at exactly the spot Brennan had indicated, motionless, nearly invisible, but surrounded by a circle of silence that announced his presence to anyone who knew how to hear it. I have spent 10 years in the Army, and nobody ever taught me this. Fraser looked at him. His expression was not smug or superior. It was the expression of a man who understood something about the gap between what armies teach and what forests know. Because your army teaches you to fight. We teach our soldiers to survive first, fight second. Different order. Same alphabet. The third morning was movement. This was the physical discipline of leaving no trace, and it required rethinking every habit Brennan had built over a decade of patrolling. Fraser started with the feet. He had Brennan walk a stretch of sandy trail at his normal pace, then took him back to the starting point and showed him his own footprints, deep and evenly spaced, a track that any halfway competent tracker could follow blindfolded. Then Fraser walked the same stretch. His prints were shallow, irregular, placed on harder ground where sand gave way to roots or rock. Where soft ground was unavoidable, he stepped on the balls of his feet and rolled outward, spreading the pressure so the print was wide and indistinct, rather than the sharp-edged stamp of a man walking with purpose. Fraser taught him to cross streams from downstream, placing his feet on submerged stones rather than the bank, letting the current wash away any mud he disturbed rather than carry it forward where it would darken the water for anyone watching from upstream. He taught him to break branches for camouflage, by bending and twisting rather than cutting, because a broken branch looks like wind damage, while a cut branch screams human presence. He showed him how to scatter pine needles and leaves in the random overlapping patterns that wind creates, rather than the even distribution that a human hand instinctively produces. Every detail was small. Every detail mattered. Because the enemy who was looking for you was not looking for anything big. He was looking for the one thing that did not belong. The fourth morning was the hardest lesson. Patience. Fraser stood Brennan at the edge of the forest and pointed to a trail that led into the pines. Walk that trail. Brennan started walking at normal patrol speed, the speed that covered ground, the speed that completed missions on time, the speed that the United States Army expected of its Special Forces soldiers. Fraser called him back after 10 meters. Again. But this time, every time you want to take a step, stop first. Observe for 2 minutes. Then step. Every single time. It took Brennan 45 minutes to cover 100 meters. His legs ached from the constant stopping and starting. His eyes were exhausted from the intensity of observation that Fraser demanded. And at the end of the 100 meters, Fraser was waiting for him with a question. How many times did you want to speed up every single step? That is the instinct your training built. Cover ground. Reach the objective. Complete the mission. And that instinct will get you killed because it tells you that moving is progress and stopping is wasting time. But in the bush, stopping is the most productive thing you can do. Every time you stop, you give your senses 2 minutes to catch something. Your movement was drowning out. Fraser paused, and then he said the sentence that would echo in Brennan's memory for the rest of his life. Slow progress where everyone survives is better than fast progress where people die. On the fifth morning, Fraser combined everything. He set Brennan loose in a section of forest where Pelletier had hidden at a position somewhere within a 200-meter square. Brennan's task was to find him without being found first. He moved the way Fraser had taught him, slowly, reading branches, listening to birds, checking the ground for prints, crossing a small stream from downstream, stopping every 20 meters to observe. It took him 90 minutes, but he found Pelletier. The birds had stopped calling near a dense patch of undergrowth at the base of a fallen pine. And when Brennan circled the area at a distance and approached from the flank, he saw the faintest trace of disturbed pine needles near the root ball. Pelletier was 3 meters away, completely invisible to the eye, but the forest had given him up to someone who finally knew how to read it. Pelletier broke cover with a grin. Le Fantôme looked impressed. "Not bad for a weak staff sergeant." On the last evening the night before the Canadians were due to leave Fort Bragg, both forces gathered in the mess hall for a farewell dinner. The same tables, the same abundant steaks and corn and an apple pie and cold Coca-Cola, but the atmosphere was transformed. Americans and Canadians sat mixed together, now conversations crossing the tables and the national boundaries without effort. Kowalski, who had challenged Tremblay in the after-action review, was sitting beside the Canadian captain, asking detailed questions about scent discipline and how to neutralize the smell of DEET in tropical environments. Hargrove had kept his promise. A case of American beer sat on the end of the Canadian table, already half empty, and the laughter that rose from that end of the room had the easy warmth of men who had earned each other's respect the hard way. Brennan sat back and watched it happen. Two groups of soldiers from two countries who had been strangers 2 weeks ago sharing food and knowledge over a table loaded with everything the American military could provide. This was what an alliance looked like when you stripped away the treaties and the diplomacy and the politics. Soldiers teaching soldiers how to stay alive. Nothing more, nothing less, and everything that mattered. After dinner, as the mess hall emptied and the evening cooled, Brennan and Tremblay found themselves on the steps outside the barracks. The stars were out sharp and white above the black silhouettes of the pine trees. Somewhere down the road, a radio was playing country music, the tinny sound drifting across the grass like a memory of somewhere else. Tremblay told Brennan about Cyprus, not the version he would put in an after-action report, the real version, the one he carried in the same place Brennan carried his compass. It was 1964. Nicosia sector. His platoon was patrolling the buffer zone between a Greek village and a Turkish strongpoint on a road that both sides claimed, and neither would yield. The olive trees along the road were old ancient with trunks thick enough to hide behind and canopies dense enough to conceal anything. One afternoon, Tremblay was leading the patrol through those trees when he noticed the silence. No birds. No goats bleating from the Turkish side. No dogs barking from the Greek side. Just the wind moving through olive leaves, which sounds like nothing else on earth, like paper rubbing against paper. He stopped the patrol. His radio operator, a 20-year-old corporal from Montreal, asked what was wrong. Tremblay could not explain it. He just knew. The olive grove felt wrong the way a room feels wrong when someone is waiting in it. He held the patrol for 20 minutes. The men were restless. The schedule was tight. Headquarters was asking for position updates. Everything in the military system was telling him to move, and the olive trees were telling him to stay. 20 minutes later, a burst of automatic fire tore through the section of road they would have been crossing if he had kept moving. Turkish irregulars, 4 of them hidden in a stone wall that bordered the grove. The burst lasted 3 seconds. If the patrol had been on schedule, those 3 seconds would have caught 8 Canadians in the open with no cover. That week in a different patrol with a different route, the ambush succeeded. 2 Canadian soldiers dead, 30 wounded. That was the day I understood what patience really means. It is not about being slow, it is about being alive. Brennan listened without speaking. The story settled over him like the darkness settling over the pines. 2 soldiers on the steps of an American barracks sharing the kind of truth that only other soldiers can hold. Tremblay finished his coffee and stood. He looked at Brennan for a moment. Then he said something that Brennan would carry alongside the compass and the carving for the rest of his life. The olive trees spoke to me that day the same way the pine forest spoke to your Canadians this week. In your Vietnam, the bamboo and the teak will speak to you too. You just have to be patient enough to listen. Brennan understood now. Not just the words, the weight behind them, the cost that Tremblay had paid to learn them. The morning came early, the way all military mornings come early, with gray light and the smell of coffee and the sound of engines warming up in the motor pool. The Canadian bus sat idling in front of the barracks, its exhaust rising in thin blue threads against the pine trees. Rucksacks were being loaded into the luggage compartment. Men were shaking hands and exchanging addresses that some would keep and others would lose. The ordinary rituals of departure that soldiers everywhere perform when a temporary bond is about to be broken by distance and duty. Fraser came around the side of the bus carrying his rucksack over one shoulder. He saw Brennan and stopped. The two men stood facing each other on the gravel, 6 feet apart, the morning sun just clearing the tops of the pines behind them. Staff Sergeant Brennan, Sergeant Fraser. A pause. The bus engine idled. A mockingbird sang from the roof of the barracks, working through its stolen repertoire of calls the way it did every morning, fearless and loud. Fraser set his rucksack down. He reached into the breast pocket of his combat shirt and brought out a small object no bigger than a man's thumb. He held it up between his fingers so Brennan could see it clearly. It was a piece of birchwood, pale and smooth, carved into the shape of a bird. The carving was simple but precise. The kind of work done by hands that had spent a lifetime shaping wood and bone and antler. The bird was a wren, tiny body, upright tail, open beak. My grandfather carved this. He was a trapper in Cape Breton, spent 60 years in the woods. He said the wren is the smallest bird in the forest, but it sings the loudest. You can hear it from 100 meters on a still morning. But the wren is also the first bird to go quiet when danger comes. Before the jays, before the crows, before anything else in the forest stops, singing, the wren has already gone silent. Fraser placed the carving in Brennan's open palm. Keep it. Let the wren warn you. Brennan looked at the tiny wooden bird. The birchwood was light and warm, almost weightless, carved with a delicacy that seemed impossible for a trapper's rough hands. He closed his fingers around it carefully, the way a man holds something that he understands is more valuable than its size suggests. Thank you, Duncan. It was the first time Brennan had called Fraser by his first name. No rank, no formality, no distance. Just one man thanking another for something that both of them understood could not be measured or repaid. Fraser nodded once, the short, firm nod of a man who did not need words to accept what words could not fully carry. Then he picked up his rucksack, turned, and climbed onto the bus. Brennan stood on the gravel as the bus pulled away. He watched it turn onto the main road and disappear behind the pine trees trailing dust. He put the wren into his chest pocket beside the compass, where both objects settled against his heartbeat, as if they had always been there together. The weeks that followed were different from any training Brennan had conducted before. He began teaching his team the skills Fraser had taught him, and he encountered exactly the resistance he expected. American soldiers trained for speed and aggression do not naturally take to the idea that slowing down is a tactical advantage. His men grumbled. They questioned. They looked at him the way soldiers look at a leader who appears to be losing his edge. Why are we crawling, Staff Sergeant? We have a mission timeline. Because I have seen what happens when you do not. He started small. On the next field exercise, he halted his team at the edge of a tree line and told them to close their eyes and listen for 2 minutes. The complaints were immediate and predictable. We are supposed to be moving to the objective, Staff Sergeant, not sitting around listening to birds. Brennan did not argue. He waited. 2 minutes later, he asked what they had heard. Nothing useful, one of his men said. Brennan nodded. Then he sent his assistant team leader into the tree line 100 meters ahead and told the team to close their eyes again. When the wren stopped calling on the left side of the tree line, 3 of his 12 men raised their hands unprompted. something moved. Over there, on the left. After that, the grumbling stopped. Not because Brennan had explained the theory, because the forest had demonstrated it. He conducted practice ambush exercises where his men took turns playing the role of the opposing force using Canadian techniques to find each other's positions. The first round was humbling. His men found positions they had thought were invisible, betrayed by the same indicators the Canadians had exploited at Fort Bragg. Boot prints, broken branches, the smell of coffee and tobacco and DEET, the silence of birds around occupied positions. Each failure was a lesson, and each lesson was absorbed with the particular intensity of men who knew they were going to Vietnam, where the difference between a lesson learned and a lesson missed was measured in body bags. By late October, the team could move through a section of forest and read it the way a tracker reads a trail. Not as well as Pelletier, probably not as well as they needed to, but well enough that they could identify disturbances that would have been invisible to them 2 months earlier. Well enough that Brennan believed they had a chance. In late November, Brennan received his deployment orders. Second tour Vietnam. He would ship out in January 1967. If this story has moved you, share it with a veteran you know. Share it with anyone who has ever been taught something they did not know they needed to learn. What happened next in a Vietnamese jungle, 7 months after Fort Bragg, is the reason this story needs to be told. The evening before he left, Brennan drove to the phone bank at the post exchange and called Scranton. The phone rang 4 times before his father answered. Michael Brennan's voice on the telephone always sounded the way coal dust smelled, rough and permanent, something that clung to everything it touched. Pat. Dad. I am deploying tomorrow. A pause. The particular silence of a father whose son is going to war. Not the first time. The second, which in some ways is worse because the first time you do not fully understand the danger, and the second time you do. Dad, I learned something at Fort Bragg. Someone taught me what you have been trying to tell me my whole life. What is that? To listen. The silence that followed was longer than any silence Brennan had heard on a telephone. It stretched across the distance between North Carolina and Pennsylvania, across the years between a 13-year-old boy standing at a mine gate and a 29-year-old soldier about to go back to war. And when Michael Brennan finally spoke, his voice carried something that Patrick had never heard in it before. Not pride exactly, something quieter, something closer to relief. Then, you will come home. Patrick Brennan arrived in Vietnam in January 1967 and was assigned to operations in Quang Tri Province, the northernmost region of South Vietnam, where the Ho Chi Minh Trail fed men and supplies from the north, and the jungle was thicker and more hostile than anything he had encountered on his first tour further south. He moved his team differently now, slower, more deliberately. They covered less ground in a day than other teams, and his after-action reports initially drew questions from officers who measured effectiveness in kilometers patrolled and contacts initiated. But Brennan's team also had something that other teams did not. They found things. Caches that other patrols walked past. Trail markers that other teams stepped over. Disturbances in the vegetation that told stories about who had passed through, and when, and in what numbers. And they did not walk into ambushes. March 1967. Quang Tri Province. Morning. Fog on the canopy. 12 Americans on a narrow trail heading toward a village where intelligence indicated Viet Cong activity. The jungle pressing in from both sides, dense and wet, the air heavy with the smell of rotting leaves and red earth. This was the moment that the opening of this story had been reaching toward. Every lesson, every failure, every quiet morning in the pine forests of Fort Bragg had been building to this trail, this fog, this silence. Staff Sergeant Patrick Brennan moved at the point with his left hand, raised fingers spread ready to close into a fist. He moved 20 meters, stopped, observed, listened. The jungle was alive around him. Gibbons calling from the canopy half a kilometer to the west. Doves cooing somewhere to the south. Insects layered in their ceaseless hum. Water dripping from broad leaves that channeled the morning dew into fat drops that struck the ground like a slow, irregular clock. 20 more meters. Stop. Listen. Everything normal. Birds calling ahead and behind. The full sound of a living forest with nothing wrong in it. 20 more meters. Stop. And there it was. The bird calls ahead of the patrol, the ones that had been a steady presence for the last hour, were thinning. Not vanishing. Thinning. The doves that had been calling from somewhere ahead had stopped. A bulbul that had been chattering from the right side of the trail had gone quiet. And the layered insect hum, which should have been uniform across the forest, had a gap in it. A pocket of reduced sound roughly 60 meters ahead, and slightly to the left of the trail, where the density of noise was less than it should have been. It was subtle. Months ago, Brennan would not have noticed it. Months ago, it would have been nothing more than the random fluctuation of a jungle soundscape that was always shifting. But Fraser had taught him to hear the difference between random silence and deliberate silence, between a bird that stops calling because it has finished its phrase and a bird that stops calling because it is afraid. Brennan closed his fist. 12 men froze. The jungle held its breath around them, their own stillness joining the larger stillness ahead, and for a long moment nothing moved and nothing spoke, and the only sound was the slow drip of water from the canopy. Brennan's eyes moved across the tree line ahead. He was looking for the indicators. Branches at wrong angles, ground disturbance, vegetation that was too even or too freshly arranged. And he found them. 60 meters ahead, where the trail curved slightly to the left and the jungle thickened into a wall of bamboo and hardwood, two things were wrong. The first was a section of undergrowth that was slightly greener than the vegetation around it. Freshly cut branches, probably taken from another area and placed here to fill a gap, their leaves still hydrated while the surrounding foliage was beginning to wilt in the morning heat. The second was the ground beneath those branches, where the leaf litter had been swept and rearranged in a pattern that was too uniform to be natural. His right hand went to his chest pocket. His fingers found the compass and the wren side by side, warm from his body, the two objects that contained everything he had learned about staying alive. He signaled his assistant team leader forward and pointed to the tree line ahead without speaking. Then he gestured to the right, a flanking route through denser jungle that would bring two men around to a position where they could observe the suspicious area from the side. The assistant team leader nodded. He had trained for this. They both had. The two scouts moved off the trail and into the jungle to the east. They moved slowly, the way Fraser had taught, placing each foot on roots and stone, avoiding soft earth, staying below the sight lines of anyone watching the trail. 20 minutes passed. Brennan held the rest of the team motionless, controlling his breathing, listening to the silence ahead, waiting for the scouts to complete their circuit. When they returned, their faces told the story before their mouths could form the words. Staff Sergeant, VC ambush. At least 2 machine gun positions dug in along the left side of the trail where it curves. We counted 6, maybe 8 fighters. There is a command detonated mine buried in the trail itself, right where the path narrows between those 2 large trees. Wire runs from the mine to a position about 15 meters back in the tree line. If we had walked the trail, the lead element would have been standing directly over the mine when it detonated. The machine guns would have caught anyone who survived in a crossfire. No cover. No escape. 12 men. All of them would have been in the kill zone within 30 seconds of triggering the ambush. The mine would have killed or wounded the point element instantly. The machine guns would have finished everyone else. Brennan looked at the trail ahead. The trail he would have walked 6 months ago without stopping. The trail that looked like every other trail in Vietnam, narrow and shadowed and leading toward the objective. Except this one had death waiting at the bend, and the only reason he knew it was there was because the birds had told him. Because a corporal from New Brunswick had taught him to hear a ghost, and a sergeant from Cape Breton had taught him to hear the silence. He led his team on a wide detour to the east through terrain so thick they had to cut their way through in places. It added 90 minutes to their movement. No one complained. They reached their objective from a different direction, completed their mission, and returned to base without a single casualty. 12 men walked out. 12 men walked back. Not a single round fired. Not a single drop of blood spilled. Slow progress where everyone survives. That night in his bunk at the forward operating base, Brennan took the wooden wren from his pocket and held it in the dim light. The tiny bird looked up at him with its carved beak open, caught forever in the act of singing, or the act of going silent. Both at once. "Thank you, Duncan," he said to the empty room. And he meant it the way a man means a prayer, not because anyone is listening, but because some things have to be said aloud to be real. The lessons from Fort Bragg in August 1966 were documented and distributed throughout the Special Forces community. Some of the techniques the Canadians taught were incorporated into the formal training curriculum at Fort Bragg and other Special Forces installations. The emphasis on reading vegetation disturbance, monitoring animal behavior as early warning indicators, and approaching terrain with the assumption that every favorable position might already be occupied entered the body of knowledge that American Special Forces carried into subsequent deployments. For the Canadians, the exercise validated their training approach and demonstrated that their tactical methods could stand alongside or surpass those of any military in the world. 2 years later, in April 1968, the Canadian Airborne Regiment was formally established, inheriting the skills and traditions of the Defense of Canada Force paratroopers, who had walked through the pine forests of Fort Bragg and left notes that ended with the word respect. The story of "We Found Your Trap" became legendary in both armies. Told and retold at mess hall tables and reunion dinners and training classrooms, the way all military stories are told, with details that shift but a core that never changes. Canadian soldiers defeated Green Beret ambush tactics through superior fieldcraft and patience. And then, instead of boasting, they taught the Americans everything they knew. And the Americans, instead of making excuses, learned. The years passed the way years pass for men who survive wars. Slowly at first, then all at once, and then slowly again. Brennan completed his second tour and came home. He served out his remaining years in the Army, transferred to a training role at Fort Bragg, where he incorporated Canadian fieldcraft techniques into every course he taught, and retired in 1975 as a Master Sergeant. He moved back to Scranton, bought a small house on the hill above the Lackawanna Valley, not far from the house where he had grown up, not far from the mine that had broken his father and given him the compass that he still carried every day. Michael Brennan died in the spring of 1979 in the same kitchen where he had eaten bacon and eggs before dawn for 20 years in the wheelchair that had been his world for 27 years. Patrick was there. He held his father's hand and felt the calluses that cold dust and time had never softened. The compass was on the table between them. Michael looked at it, looked at his son, and spoke one word. Listened. Patrick nodded. His throat was too tight for more than 2 words. "I listened, Dad." Then Michael Brennan closed his eyes, and the mind finally took him all the way down. In the autumn of 1985, Patrick Brennan received a letter at his home in Scranton. The return address was Ottawa, Canada. Inside was an invitation to a Canadian military veterans reunion specifically honoring personnel who had served in joint exercises with Allied forces during the 1960s. A handwritten note was clipped to the invitation. The handwriting was small, precise, and slanted slightly to the left. "Pat, I hope this finds you well. Some of us are gathering in Ottawa in October. I hear you retired. So did I. Perhaps we can share a coffee and talk about birds. Duncan." Brennan flew to Ottawa on a Tuesday morning in October. The air was cold, and the maple trees along the Rideau Canal were burning red and gold in the way that only Canadian maples burn, with a ferocity of color that seems impossible for something so quiet. He wore a dark suit and a tie he had not worn in years, and he carried nothing in his pockets except the compass and the wren. The reunion was held in a function room at a hotel near Parliament Hill. Brennan walked through the door and into a room full of men his age, men with gray hair and weathered faces, and the particular posture of people who had spent their youth carrying heavy things over long distances. Canadian flags on the walls, coffee and sandwiches on long tables. The low murmur of conversations conducted in English and French, sometimes both at once. He scanned the room. It took less than 10 seconds. Duncan Fraser stood near the window at the far end of the room. He was 51 now, his hair gone fully white, his face thinner but still carrying the quiet watchfulness of a man who had never stopped reading the world around him. He was holding a cup of coffee and talking to another veteran, but his eyes found Brennan the moment Brennan walked through the door. The way a man trained to notice movement in a tree line notices movement in a crowded room. They met in the middle of the floor. 19 years, 2 countries, 2 careers, 2 lifetimes of everything that happens between the age of 30 and the age of 50. And yet the distance between them closed as if none of it had passed. Brennan reached into his pocket. He pulled out the birchwood wren and held it up between his fingers, the same way Fraser had held it up on a gravel lot in North Carolina 19 years before. The carving was darker now, the pale birchwood aged to honey by decades of body heat and handling. The tiny beak was still open, still singing, still silent, still, "It warned me, Duncan, in Vietnam." The wren went quiet and I listened. Fraser looked at the carving, then he looked at Brennan. And the man who had spent his life listening rather than speaking, the quiet sergeant from Cape Breton, who had taught an American soldier to hear what the force was saying, stepped forward and put his arms around Brennan and held him. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say that the embrace did not already carry. 2 soldiers from 2 countries trained in 2 different philosophies of war, brought together by a training exercise that was supposed to be routine and turned out to be the most important week of both their lives. One had taught the other to listen. The other had listened, and 11 men had come home alive because of it. Marcel Tremblay was there too. Older, grayer, still carrying the calm that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than personality. He shook Brennan's hand with both of his own, and his dark brown eyes held the warmth of a man who remembered everything and regretted nothing. Patrick Brennan lived the rest of his life in Scranton. He sat on the porch of his house on the hill above the Lackawanna Valley and drank his coffee every morning and listened to the birds in the yard. Real birds. Living birds. Wrens among them. The Carolina wren, small and brown and absurdly loud for its size, would perch on the porch railing and sing its tea kettle call directly at him. Fearless and present, as if it knew something about the man in the chair that other people did not. On the table beside his coffee sat 2 objects. The brass mining compass, its crystal cracked its needle still pointing north, and the birchwood wren darkened with age beak, open singing and silent at the same time. This is not a story about failure. It is a story about what happens after failure when the people who failed are brave enough to ask why, and the people who succeeded are generous enough to explain. It is a story about the value of allies not measured in treaties, but in knowledge shared and lives saved. And it is a story about America at its finest. Not America the undefeated, America the teachable. The nation that has always been at its greatest, not when it refused to lose, but when it lost, and then learned faster than anyone else in the world. The Green Berets did not win the exercise at Fort Bragg in August of 1966. They won something better. They won the knowledge that sometimes the best victory begins with someone else's note left in your fighting hole, ending with a single word: respect. If you are sitting somewhere this morning listening to the birds outside your window, remember that the smallest one sings the loudest, and it goes quiet first when danger comes. Listen.